Well, great pleasure to be here. I'm going to change tack slightly and talk a little bit about the value of forests from a more global perspective. Can I move this computer off, actually, altogether? Would you mind? Otherwise, all these papers are going to fall on the floor. Start with an obvious fact, really, and that is the extent to which people have relied on forests for all sorts of things since people have been people, really. So for food, for medicines, and for fuel. And it's quite instructive maybe to notice that around the world, and it depends on whose figures you look at, there's about 1.5 billion people, mostly in the tropics, who are still directly dependent on forests for their day-to-day needs. The Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study that was published a couple of years ago described those benefits from forests and other ecosystems as the GDP of the poor, not inside a market, not reflected in transactions you'd see in national accounts, but nonetheless sustaining the needs of a great many people. And of course, it's no different for us, except that the benefits we get for forests living in Western countries are generally these days very much in the market. And so you see certain benefits of forests that have been literally industrialized. And Ted showed us at the beginning of his talk, you know, how forests these days are treated almost like farms in the way in which we take certain things from them. And so going to Southeast Asia, you will see forests comprised of one species in the form of the oil palm. You go to Brazil and you will see forests of rubber trees. Go to the Mediterranean, you will see forests of olives and forests of oranges. And obviously in this part of the world, you'll see forests of fast-growing conifers being used to make timber and paper, and indeed increasingly fast-growing coppice to be used in fuel. And so what we've done in many Western countries is take our approach towards agriculture and to intensify through monocultural practices those aspects of forest which perhaps are most immediately visible to us in the things that we need and things that we can offer into markets. And that's fine, obviously, up to a point, and has been a hugely successful strategy in being able to sustain the kind of lifestyles that we enjoy in the West with high quantities of raw material, cheap food, and to have facilitated this massive expansion in the human population. We've done it through a process of intensification and monoculture in large part. And I think that's really characterised the mindset that we've had towards forest ecosystems over the last century or so. And so what's wrong with that, you might ask? Well, looking from a global perspective, I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that by prioritising one set of practical market-visible values, we've actually begun to undermine in quite a serious way a series of so far non-market values which are equally important for our continued welfare. So what are those services that we've neglected? Well, one, obviously, is the conservation of biological diversity. So 70% of terrestrial biodiversity on the Earth is located in forests, with the vast majority of that being in tropical forests and most of that in the tropical rainforests. And biodiversity, we all know, is beautiful and it's absolutely wonderful and we should conserve it, but actually it's got a huge practical value for us, not least seen, for example, in the fact if you go into a chemist shop in this country, you will find that a lot of the prescription drugs you will take out of there, or indeed non-prescription drugs, are based upon compounds first identified in wild animals and plants living in forest ecosystems. Many of our food crops, of course, were initially forest trees, and as the climate changes, and indeed as diseases spread across the world, the genetic pool that's inside the wild relatives of our crop plants and plantation species is going to be really quite important. Another route towards the future solving of challenges in relation to climate change and resource depletion is going to be through biomimicry and harnessing the solutions that have been invented by wild animals and plants and using them in engineering. And one example that I came across the other day is how Chrysler are now building a new car, the chassis of which is based upon a fish skeleton, and as a result of copying the fish, they've been able to reduce the amount of steel they're using at the same time as increase the strength of the vehicle. They couldn't have done that had the fish gone extinct. And actually one other example I came across recently, which is a less happy example, is the case of the Gastric brooding frogs. I don't know if you've come across these animals. You probably saw them on Life on Earth with David Attenborough years ago. These frogs swallow their tadpoles, and they do this in order to reduce the predation of their larvae. And one of the things they did, obviously, to be able to stop digesting their own young, was to develop defensive chemicals to put around the tadpoles in their stomachs. And some biochemists thought, well, this is going to be a potential cure for peptic ulcers, which cause misery for millions of people across the world. The peptic ulcer cures cannot be derived from that source now, however, because the habitat of these animals was destroyed and they went extinct. So we'll never know how the gastric brooding frog managed to do this trick. And the more we deforest natural forests, the more we close down the possibilities for these kinds of benefits in the future. But they're non-market benefits, because if we don't know it's there, we can't sell it. This is about opportunity cost. And so how are we going to protect the opportunity cost of biodiversity? Big question. Another thing we get from forests, which sometimes we may not notice immediately, is various water services. And Ted finished up there with United Utilities, and one of the ways in which they're trying to keep water quality up in the Lake District through planting trees near to water bodies. There's a great deal of material out there now developing in terms of why water and forests are two sides of the same coin. And in fact, you might find a clue in the word rainforest, actually, which does seem to be something that a few countries are now beginning to know in terms of a possible connection between their national economic development and conserving these ecosystems. And I was with the Brazilian government a few years ago in Brasilia with some work I was doing with the Prince's Rainforests project, and had a conversation with various ministers there, and suddenly it seemed that the conversation had altered. I used to work for Friends of the Earth for many years, and I used to run campaigns about saving the Amazon. And the Brazilian government, they weren't very pleased about this, and at one point suggested they might take the chainsaws to the environmentalists. And so I was never very welcome in ministerial circles down there. But this conversation was very different, because they'd realised that this connection between rain and forest actually was really important for their GDP. And there's two reasons why this is. So for the first thing is that 80% of Brazil's electricity comes from hydroelectric dams. And hydroelectric dams are fueled by rivers, and the rivers are topped up by rain, and the forest is the source of that. And you'll know from the geography of South America that even though there is a great expanse of land between the ocean and the wet forest on the west of the country, the forest is endlessly recycling the rain across. And those dams in the western Amazon rely on the forest in order to keep them topped up. And the other thing, of course, is to bear in mind that the clouds don't stay over the forest, they travel. And the highly productive sugarcane, soybean and ranching in the south of Brazil is basically fueled by the Amazon. And they began to realise this, and things were beginning to change. I also recently came across the case of tea estates in Kenya, where a great deal of that country's GDP is being produced by the export of that beverage, which we enjoy here and elsewhere. And the plantation manager's telling me about the Mau forest and how this is helping to transport rain from Lake Victoria, which is evaporating from the lake. It goes over the forest, it gets topped up, the clouds get big enough to produce rain, and you've got tea estates. The forest is being cleared, and the tea estates are becoming less and less viable. Also recently came across the case of the Uluguru Mountains in Tanzania, a part of the world with highly seasonal rainfall. And in the dry season, the only reason the rivers are flowing is because of cloud forests some miles from the coast. At about 2,000 metres up in the mountains, these forests are actually harvesting water from the clouds. It's not actually raining up there, but the trees are festooned with epiphytes and mosses and ferns, and they've got a very deep leaf litter layer underneath the trees. And the trees are harvesting the clouds and dropping the water into the leaf litter, and that keeps the rivers running in the dry season, including for the capital city, Dar es Salaam, with 4 million people and most of the country's industry. Without the cloud forests, there is no industry, there is no domestic life in that city. And then we have the benefits coming from forests, another non-market value in terms of protection we get, and the protection we get for infrastructure, property and life through ameliorating extreme events. And perhaps the most extreme example I saw of this was in El Salvador some years ago after Hurricane Mitch went through that country and neighbouring Honduras. And the effects of that storm were devastating. It was the second most destructive Atlantic storm in history. It killed 18,000 people in that country. And I was taken to various areas where there were mudslides and literally entire villages were swept away. And in the areas of highest deforestation, with the highest areas of loss of life, and property damage. And you see that repeated across the world. And I think that non-market value of forests is going to get more and more important as we see the more extreme impacts coming from climatic warming, which we now know is happening. And we had a more recent example of that of Cockermouth up in the Lake District a few years ago. And indeed, there's been plenty of others recently, not just forests, but also the damage to peatlands, where the interception of rainfall can ameliorate flooding. By removing the trees, the flooding can increase. And then there's the biggest issue of all, climate change, and the extent to which forests are playing a role in helping us to not only cope with the effects of it, but also to cope with reducing the causes of it. And there's a great deal to be said about this, but one statistic which I find absolutely staggering is a recent estimate from CSIRO in Australia, a report published in 2010 looking at climate and forest interactions at a global level. They concluded through some very detailed research that something like 1/3 of the carbon dioxide emissions we're putting into the atmosphere from fossil fuels every year, so from factories, power stations, vehicles, planes, about 1/3 of it is being soaked up by forests, and mostly tropical rainforests. And the interesting thing about this is I always thought that, a climax forest is pretty stable in a climatic sense, but actually it's not. The accumulation of peat under some forests, the growth in the thickness of trees, the gradual accumulation of carbon-rich materials, even in a primary forest, is leading to this really quite substantial global ecosystem service. And so if you take the forests away, which of course we are doing, then you reduce not only their carbon capture abilities, but also the release of carbon into the atmosphere. And this is really a very serious problem. And it's amazing, actually, the numbers that can be attached to this. So even if you use the low price of carbon that's being traded at the moment in the European Emissions Trading Scheme, one estimate from the British government, this is from 2009, the Eliash Review, concluded that the economic benefit of reducing deforestation by 50% by 2030 in terms of the carbon capture benefits would be $3.7 trillion. So we argue about wind turbines and about nuclear power stations and energy efficiency, when in fact one of the major services in terms of carbon abatement is being carried out by forests, and it's not really anywhere to be seen in terms of how we're calculating the value of these systems at the national level, which I think is really quite an omission. And then another economically valuable, but so far non-market benefit we get from forests is in relation to public health. And various people have been researching and publishing around the consequences of people's exposure to nature in recent years, and there's a very consistent theme coming back in terms of chronic disease, in particular depression, blood pressure and certain other things. That exposure to natural areas actually helps at a social level, society level, to reduce the impacts and help people get better more quickly. And there's obviously a few experimental things going on, including in this country, whereby forests are being conserved deliberately next to population centres in order to bring health benefits. So I guess what I'm saying is, you look at the history of our relationship with forests, going from hunter-gatherers and small-scale exploitation to the industrial-scale monoculture, which is kind of where we're at now. And I think the future at the global level in terms of how we look at forests is about finding ways of capturing these non-market, so far, non-market values in terms of flood protection, the water cycle, carbon, biodiversity and public health, and finding ways of reflecting that into a new approach. And it's happening in different parts of the world. I mentioned Brazil already. They've actually managed to cut their deforestation rate by 90% compared to 2004, would you believe? And I'm convinced that at the political level, the reason they're now enforcing the forest code is because they put two and two together in terms of the water benefit and realised that Brazil's economy will not grow as much or as fast or as far if they cut the forest down. There's the example of Guyana, country in northeastern South America, and during the work we did with the Prince's Rainforest Project, we got to know that country pretty well, not least because this was a country that had decided to offer its carbon services on the global stage to the world, which was struggling to cut carbon. In this country, we're finding it hard, so is the US and everywhere else. That country said, we'll keep our forest intact as a global carbon utility, but we'll need some money for that, please. And so the sums of money are actually pretty small. $5 per tonne was what they were asking for in terms of keeping the carbon in the trees. They said if we can get that, we won't have to cut it down to end poverty here, and do that through growing soya beans and cattle. We'll do it through providing the carbon benefit to the world. Anyone interested in buying it, Fortunately, the Norwegians turned up with $250 million, which they're now dispersing to Guyana as a deliberate strategy to keep the country completely covered with natural tropical rainforest. And by buying the carbon, we're getting at least 3 other things for nothing. We're getting the water, the biodiversity, and of course the cultural diversity of the indigenous people who live there, all rolled into the same bargain. I saw an example in Bogota, also on the water side last year, during the course of writing a book that actually has a lot of these examples I'm talking about now. It's called What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? And you get the great long list like the Romans. But in Bogota, there was this rather marvellous example of how that city has decided that in order to continue to grow from 7 to 10 million people over the next 20 years, they're going to need an awful lot of water for industry, domestic purpose and everything else. And so what they're trying to do is restore the temperate forests on the high Andes above the city. It's nearly all gone. There's almost none of that forest left. And it used to be stuffed full of endemic animals and plants. So they're trying to put that back up there in order to keep the soil on the hillsides, to stop their reservoirs sedimenting up, and also to keep the high altitude peatlands intact in order to keep a water store up there to replenish the reservoirs in dry times. And actually, in the process of doing the latter, we're going to get the conservation of the Andean condor and the spectacled bear as well. So another example of those kinds of synergies that you can get from this kind of approach of looking at the wider economic values. So some of these things, the process in some ways is kind of going on from, we can see the market value in a stand of Sitka spruce. We can see the market value in a stand of oil palm trees. Can we find the market value in carbon, water, biodiversity and the rest of it? Well, I think it's beginning to come. A couple of the examples I've mentioned, in Colombia, for example, above Bogota, that is a payment for ecosystem services scheme there, whereby money is being derived from the users of the service and being paid to the providers of the service. And in that case, it's a beer company called Bavaria who need lots of clean water to make lots of lager. It's the city, which needs clean water for the citizens and doing that through a water utility. They're getting together with the conservationists to say, actually, it's cheaper for us to pay those farmers to put the temperate forest back than it is to build new reservoirs, flood defences and water filtration equipment. And so the money basically is being sent up the hill and it's being done in a way where it's going to be cheaper for the city to secure its water security than if they built all this other concrete stuff. So these are the kinds of things that can be done, which increasingly are being done. And the Guyana example is another payment for ecosystem services example there. And I think over the years we'll be seeing more of it, including hopefully in this country. I'm helping at the moment a little process with the British government called the Ecosystems Markets Task Force. And I know the idea of ecosystems markets fills people with horror, and it does me at times. But nonetheless, I do think that if we get this in proportion and find the right ways in which we can create synergies between different things that are not yet in the market, but which should be in the market in terms of how we look at nature, then maybe we will be able to do more to go beyond monocultures and to realise this full range of benefits that we get from forests at the global level. And of course, doing that in this country as well, because everywhere is part of the global picture and everywhere needs to be part of the solution. Thanks very much indeed.